Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stacy Stanislaw, and I'm the Communications Manager for the Drexel Libraries. I want to thank you for joining us for this afternoon's webinar called Copyright and Fair Use Issues in Archival Research, which is presented by Matthew Lyons, our University Archivist. Today's webinar is part of the library's new event series called Wednesdays at Noon, which brings together different expert library staff and members of the Drexel community for weekly training sessions and discussions. As you may have guessed from the title, Wednesdays at Noon events are held every Wednesday at 12 p.m. throughout the winter and the spring terms, and we hope you'll consider attending some of our other upcoming events, and I'll share a link to those in just a second in the chat. So quick reminder, we are recording this session, so you can watch this at any time after the event ends, and you can watch the other sessions we're hosting if you happen to miss them. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Matthew.
Okay, thank you, Stacy, and thank you all for coming. Let me see, I'm going to now see if I can share my screen and bring up my slideshow. Let's see. All right. And let's see. Yeah. There. People see the slides now? I hope. Okay. Hi, and welcome to Drexel University Library's webinar on copyright and fair use issues in archival research. I'm Matthew Lyons, Drexel University Archivist. Copyright questions come up in academia in a number of ways. For example, if you're publishing a journal article, do you need to get permission to reuse somebody else's diagram? Or if you're putting together a course packet, what portion of somebody else's book can you include? All right. In this webinar, I'm going to look specifically at how copyright issues apply if you're working with archival records. I'll start by covering some basics about copyright and fair use, then look at them in relation to archival research. I'll discuss how archivists go about balancing copyright concerns with our responsibility to make collections available for fair use. And I'll offer some general guidelines for archival researchers on how to navigate two key questions. When do I need to get permission? And who do I get permission from? Before I go further, I want to offer a couple of caveats. First, I'm going to be talking about copyright-related principles and issues specifically in the United States. Intellectual property laws and practices vary from country to country. So if your use of materials takes place outside the US, for example, if you are publishing an article in Europe or Canada or Latin America, some of what I'm saying may not apply. Second, although I have significant experience in dealing with copyright as an archivist, I am not a lawyer and I am not qualified to give legal advice. Depending on what you are dealing with, there are some situations where you may want to consult with an intellectual property lawyer. Okay, to start with, what is copyright? Copyright is a legal principle that gives the creator of an original work a degree of control over how and when their work is used and distributed for a limited period of time. Copyright applies to books and articles, stories, photographs, architectural drawings, paintings and sculpture, musical compositions, computer software, audiovisual recordings, and other kinds of works. It applies to both published works, such as pamphlets and magazines, and unpublished ones, such as letters and meeting minutes. Some things cannot be copyrighted, such as ideas, titles, slogans, internet domain names, and cooking recipes. Copyright is a type of property that can be inherited, bought and sold, or given away. It can be held by one person, by multiple people, or by a corporate entity such as a business or a university. In the United States, copyright law has gone through a series of changes. For example, it used to be that you had to formally register a work with the government for it to be copyrighted, but that's no longer true. For newer works, copyright applies whether you register them or not. A work that is not in copyright is said to be in the public domain. That means you are free to use it without any copyright restrictions. Works in the public domain include all works created by the federal government and some works created by state governments, anything published in the US before 1926, and works whose copyright has expired. Determining whether a work is in the public domain can be complicated. It may depend on when it was created, whether it was published and when, what medium it's in, and other factors. An excellent guide to determining whether a work is in the public domain is available from Cornell University Library's Copyright Information Center. This guide is updated every January. And this will be included at the end of the presentation in the set of references. If a work is under copyright, many types of use are only allowed with the permission of the copyright owner. However, some uses are protected and don't require the copyright owner's permission. Many of these are grouped under the concept of fair use. Generally, making copies of a work for a private study or scholarly research and certain kinds of distribution for teaching purposes are considered fair use. However, the law doesn't precisely spell out what is and is not considered fair use, but leaves it to the courts to determine based on a number of factors. What kind of work it is, how you want to use it and why, how much of the work you want to use, and how the use will affect the work's value or marketability. For example, distributing material to a limited audience is more likely to be considered fair use than making it available to everybody. And disseminating excerpts from a work is more likely to be considered fair use than reproducing the whole thing. So in a lot of cases, there's significant room for interpretation and disagreement in determining whether a particular use is fair use or not. Even if you think that a particular use is fair, the copyright holder might disagree. Fair use doesn't give you automatic protection. It's a tool for evaluating risk and an argument you can use if the copyright owner contests your usage. So if you're going to rely on fair use rather than seek permission, it's important to be familiar with the principles and factors involved and how they are usually applied. How does all this apply to archival materials? Let's look at this question first from the standpoint of archivists and archival institutions, the keepers of the material. For archivists, copyright issues largely center on the question, what kinds of access can we provide to the materials in our holdings? Providing access to our collections is a high priority and essential responsibility for archives. We collect things so that they can be used. At the same time, we have to balance access with other considerations. For example, we protect the privacy of medical and student records for both ethical and legal reasons, and we limit the physical handling of fragile materials so they'll be available for the long term. Copyright is one of those considerations, and it sometimes means we have to limit access to a collection or how a collection is used. For archives, a key issue is that physical ownership and copyright ownership are two separate things. Even if an archive owns a collection of physical items or digital files, somebody else may own the copyright, or different people may own the copyright to different materials within the collection. For example, if somebody gives Drexel University Archives a collection of correspondence, they may transfer copyright to us as part of the donation. But the donor can only transfer the copyrights that they own to begin with, which usually means the letters and emails that they wrote, not the incoming correspondence. For any letters and emails that the donor received, the copyright is typically held by the people who wrote them, or by their heirs. Identifying and locating the copyright holders can be difficult, or in some cases, impossible. So as archivists assess how we provide access to our collections, we have to be mindful of copyright claims, some of which may be complicated or obscure. This affects how archivists respond to requests for copies and requests to use an item in a publication, on a website, or in an exhibition. We also have to be mindful of copyright in deciding which materials to make available online ourselves. Practices vary from one archival institution to another because there's significant gray area in determining which uses are fair use. And in the face of that uncertainty, there are differences in how different institutions choose to manage risk. Now let's look at copyright and fair use from the standpoint of the archival researchers. In the introduction to this webinar, I referred to two key questions for researchers using archival materials. When do I need to get permission, and who do I get permission from? Let's take these one at a time. First, when do you need permission to make or get copies of archival materials? Policies vary among archival institutions, but in this area, I think the policies at Drexel University Archives are at least fairly common. If a collection is not restricted, University Archives researchers are usually free to use its contents for private study, research, or scholarship, and to share them with students as part of a course. Because these activities are probably covered by fair use, although there's no guarantee. For these purposes, you may photograph collection materials, or you can request scans or photocopies. However, you will need to get permission if you want to publish an item, post it on a website, share it on social media, or include it in an exhibition. That brings us to the second key question for archival researchers concerning copyright. If you do need to get permission for using collection materials, who do you get permission from? There are actually two answers because, as I said earlier, there are two different types of ownership and therefore two different types of permission involved. If the material in question is under copyright, you will need to get permission from the copyright holder. But also, whether or not it's under copyright, you will need to get permission from Drexel University Archives for use of the physical item or digital file. For collection items where Drexel holds the copyright, we will draw up a permission agreement specifying which items may be used, who may use them, and for what purpose. For items where someone else holds the copyright, it's the researcher's responsibility to secure the copyright holder's written permission. So how do you determine who holds the copyright? Again, let's use Drexel University Archives as an example to illustrate the kinds of cases you're likely to encounter at many archival institutions. Collection materials in our holdings fall into four copyright categories. In the public domain, Drexel holds copyright, someone else holds copyright, and the copyright holder is unknown or cannot be contacted. First, there are materials in the public domain. All documents published by the federal government or created by federal employees as part of their job are in the public domain. So are all works published in the United States before 1926, or published without a copyright notice up through 1977. For unpublished works, copyright expires 70 years after the author's death, or 120 years after creation if the author's death date is unknown. There are many special cases. Again, see that handy chart about copyright term in the public domain from the Cornell University Library's Copyright Information Center. For University Archives-owned materials that are in the public domain, copyright restrictions don't apply, but to publish or exhibit them, you will still need to get our permission for the usage rights. Next, for many items in our holdings, Drexel University holds the copyright. This category includes many of Drexel's institutional records that were created by university employees or contractors for hire, as well as many items that were donated to the university archives by faculty, alums, or others. For these materials, you can obtain all the necessary permissions from university archives. The third category is materials in our collections whose copyright is held by another person, organization, or business. This includes many incoming letters and emails, as I noted before. It includes many pamphlets, serials, and other publications by companies or organizations other than Drexel. It also includes many photographs, particularly photos by professional photographers. If the name of the photographer or studio is stamped on the back of a photo print, it's best to assume that they retain the copyright even if they took the photo for the university. For these and other cases, archive staff can help you try to determine the copyright owner, although the information we have to go on is often limited. That brings me to the last copyright category, which is materials whose copyright owner is unknown or cannot be contacted. For many items, there's not enough information to determine who holds the copyright because we don't know who created it or because the copyright holder is deceased, but their heirs are unknown. In other cases, we have a name for the presumptive copyright holder, but no way to contact them. For example, because no address is available, or they're an organization or a business that no longer exists. Materials in one of these situations are called orphan works. Orphan works present special challenges to anyone who wants to reproduce or distribute them. The U.S. Copyright Office itself has acknowledged that orphan works are a problem, or as they put it, quote, "The uncertainty surrounding the ownership status of orphan works does not serve the objectives of the copyright system," close quote. The Copyright Office and others have recommended legislative changes to sort out the confusion, but no such changes have been implemented so far. In the meantime, the Society of American Archivists has put out a useful statement of best practices on how to undertake reasonable efforts to identify and track down copyright holders. Even if it doesn't succeed, a serious good faith effort to locate rights holders may help protect the user against claims of copyright infringement. Some archival institutions may have the staffing and resources to enable them to search for copyright holders, while others may leave that up to the patron. What about fees? A copyright holder may or may not charge a licensing fee for use of copyrighted materials in a publication, website, or exhibition. Separately from that, an archives may or may not charge a usage fee for use of the instance of a work that they hold in their collections, even if that work is in the public domain. And the archives may or may not charge various service fees for things like scanning, duplication, search and retrieval, and shipping. All of these fees will depend on the policies of the specific institution and possibly other factors, such as whether the request is for commercial or non-commercial use. To sum up, let me highlight a few key points. Archivists balance copyright claims with our responsibility to make our collections available for use. Generally speaking, if you're copying archival materials for the purpose of research or teaching, it's more likely to be considered fair use. However, you probably need to get permission from both the archives and the copyright holder if you want to publish an item, post it on a website or on social media, or put it in an exhibition. An archives controls the usage of the collection materials it owns, but it doesn't necessarily hold the copyright to those materials because physical ownership and copyright ownership are two separate things. It can be difficult or even impossible to identify and locate copyright holders for archival materials. Archive staff may be able to help you determine an item's copyright status and copyright holder. And to use archival material in a publication or exhibit, you might or might not be charged fees for licensing, usage, reproduction, and other services. Okay, that concludes my presentation. I'm going to leave this up for a couple minutes to give you a list of a few key resources about copyright and archival research. If you'd like to learn more, please contact us at archives@drexel.edu. Thanks.